The morning bells of the Hegemony Council rang across the crystal spires of Centralis Prime, as they had for 3,000 years. The sound carried through the perfect atmosphere, reaching every corner of the most important planet in the galaxy. Today, like every day for the past 3 millennia, the 5 elder species would gather to maintain the order that kept billions of worlds in perfect harmony. Captain Sarah Chen of the United Earth ship Defiance did not hear those bells. She was currently 300 light-years away, standing knee-deep in mud on a planet that did not even have a proper name. The Hegemony Council called it Mining World 7 Alpha 432. Sarah called it a pain in her backside. "Ma'am, we've got another problem," called Lieutenant Rodriguez from across the excavation site. He was pointing at a section of ground where the mining equipment had stopped working. Again. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead and walked over. The humans had been on this world for 6 months now, ever since the Hegemony Council had graciously allowed Earth to join the galaxy. Well, not really join. They had been given what the Council called probationary species status, which meant they could exist as long as they followed every rule, law, and tradition that the galaxy had created over thousands of years. "What is it this time?" Sarah asked, looking at the broken excavator. The machine hit something hard about 10 feet down. "The Vorthak supervisors say we need to file a report and wait for instructions. Could take 3 weeks." Sarah looked at the young officer. Rodriguez had been with her crew for 2 years, back when they were still exploring their own solar system. He was a good kid, but he was still learning that space was not like Earth. Out here, everything had rules. Everything had procedures. Everything took forever. 3 weeks to dig 10 feet? Sarah asked. "That's what they said, ma'am. Proper protocols must be followed." Sarah had heard those words many times since arriving in Hegemony space. The Vorthak were one of the 5 elder species, and they loved their protocols. They had protocols for breathing, protocols for eating, and probably protocols for thinking. Sarah had read somewhere that a Vorthak needed to file 17 different forms just to change the color of their uniform. "Get me a shovel," Sarah said. "Ma'am?" "A shovel, Rodriguez. You know, the thing humans used to dig holes before we had fancy alien machines." Rodriguez looked nervous. "But ma'am, the protocols—" "Can kiss my human backside," Sarah finished. "Get me a shovel." 20 minutes later, Sarah was digging by hand while half her crew watched and the other half kept lookout for Vorthak supervisors. It did not take long to find what the machine had hit. Sarah's shovel clinked against something that was definitely not rock. "Bring me the portable scanner," she called up. The scanner beeped and hummed as Sarah ran it over the buried object. The display showed something that made her heart race. The object was not natural. It was metal, but not any metal that humans knew how to make. The scanner said it was at least 5,000 years old. "Ma'am?" Rodriguez called down. "The Vorthak supervisors are coming back." Sarah looked at the scanner readings again. 5,000 years old. That was older than the Hegemony Council itself. This was big. This was the kind of discovery that could change everything humans knew about the galaxy. The Vorthak supervisors arrived just as Sarah climbed out of the hole. They were tall, thin beings with gray skin and 4 arms. They moved with the precise, calculated steps that their species was famous for. Everything they did was planned, measured, and approved by committee. "Human Chen," said the lead supervisor, in a voice that sounded like a computer. "You have deviated from approved excavation procedures. This requires a formal report." "We found something," Sarah said, holding up the scanner. The supervisor's large black eyes looked at the device. "All discoveries must be reported through proper channels. Form 847B must be filed with the Archaeological Council. Processing time is 6 to 8 standard weeks." Sarah stared at the alien. 6 to 8 weeks? Just to look at what we found?" "Correct. All archaeological findings fall under Hegemony cultural protection statutes. No unauthorization examination is permitted." "Unauthorized examination? We're the ones who found it." The supervisor's head tilted slightly, which Sarah had learned was the Vorthak equivalent of confusion. Finding does not equal ownership. All historical artifacts belong to the appropriate cultural heritage species. If this object predates the hegemony, it belongs to the Etherian archives. Sarah felt her blood pressure rising. The Etherians were another one of the elder species. They were mysterious ancient beings who claimed to be the spiritual guardians of the galaxy. They collected old things and locked them away in places where no one could study them. So we do all the work, take all the risks, and then hand over. Anything interesting to someone else? Correct, the supervisor said. This is the way of the hegemony. Order through proper procedure. Sarah looked back at the hole where her crew had been digging. 6 months of hard work in the mud and heat. And now some ancient aliens were going to take away the first interesting thing they had found. She thought about Earth, about the billions of humans who were depending on these mining operations to establish humanity's place in the galaxy. No, she said. The supervisor's forearms moved in what Sarah recognized as a gesture of confusion. Please clarify your statement. I said no, we found it. We're going to study it. If the Etherians want it, they can come here and ask nicely. Supervisor's black eyes seemed to grow larger. Human Chen, you cannot refuse hegemony protocols. This is not permitted. Watch me, Sarah said. 3 hours later, Sarah was in her ship's communication room speaking with Admiral Harrison back on Earth. The Admiral's face on the screen looked tired. Sarah knew he had been dealing with hegemony bureaucracy for months, trying to negotiate better conditions for human colonies. Captain Chen, the Admiral said, please tell me you did not just start a diplomatic incident over a hole in the ground. Sir, this could be big. The scanner readings show technology that predates anything in hegemony records. If we can study it, we might learn something that could help humanity. Admiral Harrison rubbed his temples. Sarah, we've been in space for exactly 18 months. The hegemony has been out here for 3,000 years. Do you really think we're going to find something they missed? Maybe. Or maybe they found it and decided it was too dangerous to study. These people have a rule for everything, Admiral. They're so afraid of making mistakes that they never try anything new. The Admiral was quiet for a moment. Sarah could hear the background noise of Earth's orbital command center. She could picture the busy officers, the constant flow of reports from human colonies across a dozen star systems. Earth was trying so hard to prove that humanity deserved a place in the galaxy. What do you need? The Admiral finally asked. Time, sir. And maybe some backup. The Vorthak supervisors are already filing reports. The Etherians will probably send a ship within the week. I can't send you military support, Sarah. That would be seen as an act of aggression. I'm not asking for weapons, sir. I'm asking for scientists. Send me Dr. Park and her team. If this thing is what I think it is, we need our best people looking at it. Admiral Harrison nodded slowly. I'll see what I can do. But Sarah, if this goes bad, Earth can't protect you. We're still the new kids here. We can't afford to make enemies. Understood, sir. But we also can't afford to let other people make all our decisions. Humanity didn't get into space by following other people's rules. After the communication ended, Sarah sat alone in her cabin, looking out the small window at the alien landscape of mining world 7 Alpha 432. The planet's 3 moons were rising, casting strange shadows across the excavation site. Somewhere, out there, buried in the mud, was something that might change everything. The next morning brought visitors. Sarah was drinking coffee in the mess hall when Lieutenant Rodriguez burst through the door. Ma'am, we've got incoming ships. 3 of them, big ones. Sarah followed Rodriguez to the observation deck. Through the transparent aluminum windows, she could see 3 massive vessels descending through the atmosphere. They were beautiful and terrible at the same time, with flowing curves that seemed to bend light around them. Sarah had seen pictures of Etherian ships before, but seeing them in person was different. They looked less like machines and more like living things made of metal and energy. "Comm channel open, ma'am," reported the communications officer. "This is Archkeeper Valdris of the Etherian Temple Fleet," came a voice that sounded like music, mixed with wind chimes. "We have come to claim what belongs to the Ancient Ones. You will cease your excavation and surrender all findings to our custody." Sarah picked up the communication device. She had practiced this conversation in her head a dozen times, but her heart was still racing. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the United Earth ship Defiance. We appreciate your interest in our excavation, but we're not done studying what we found. If you'd like to discuss joint research opportunities, I'm open to negotiations." There was a long pause. Sarah could imagine the Etherian crew discussing her response. The elder species were not used to being told no, especially by humans. "Captain Chen," the musical voice finally replied, "you do not understand. This is not a negotiation. The Codex Universalis clearly states that all pre-hegemony artifacts fall under Etherian protection. You have no authority to refuse." "With respect, Archkeeper Valdris, I've read the Codex. It says artifacts belong to their original creators. We don't know who created this thing yet. Until we do, it stays where it is." Another pause, longer this time. Sarah could see movement on the Etherian ships. Their weapon systems were powering up. "Captain Chen, you force us to remind you that humanity exists in this galaxy by the grace of the Hegemony Council. Do not test that grace." Sarah felt anger building in her chest. For 6 months she had watched her crew work themselves to exhaustion following alien rules, mining materials that would be sold by alien merchants, living by alien laws that seemed designed to keep humanity in its place. "Archkeeper, let me remind you of something. Humans didn't ask for your permission to exist. We didn't ask for your permission to reach the stars. And we're sure not going to ask for your permission to learn about our universe. The artifact stays here until we're done studying it. If you don't like that, you're welcome to file a complaint with whoever handles your paperwork." The communication channel went silent. Sarah could see more activity on the Etherian ships. She had just told one of the most powerful species in the galaxy to go file a complaint. She was either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly, "our defensive systems are pretty basic compared to theirs." "I know," Sarah replied, "but sometimes you have to stand up to bullies even when they're bigger than you." The standoff lasted 3 days. The Etherian ships remained in orbit while Sarah's crew continued their excavation. Dr. Park and her team arrived on the 2nd day, brought by a fast courier ship from Earth. They immediately began studying the artifact, which turned out to be even more interesting than Sarah had hoped. The object was a data storage device of some kind, containing information in a language that predated any known civilization. Dr. Park's initial analysis suggested it might contain star charts showing safe passages through dangerous regions of space. If the translation was correct, it could cut travel time between distant galaxies by months or even years. On the 3rd day, everything changed. Sarah was reviewing Dr. Park's latest reports when the ship's alarm system activated. Red lights flashed throughout the corridor as Sarah ran to the bridge. "Report," she called out. "Unknown ships jumping into the system," replied the sensor officer. "Multiple signatures. Big ones." The main screen showed what was happening in orbit above them. The 3 Etherian ships were still there, but they were no longer alone. A fleet of angular, aggressive-looking vessels had appeared nearby. Sarah recognized the design from her briefings on galactic politics. These were Kralian Empire warships. "Incoming transmission," reported the communications officer. "This is War Leader Thakix of the Kralian 4th Battle Fleet," came a harsh, growling voice. "We claim right of conquest over this world and all its contents. Etherian vessels will withdraw immediately or face destruction." Sarah sat down hard in her command chair. The Kralians were the military power of the galaxy, a species that had built an empire through strength and honor. They did not negotiate. They did not compromise. They took what they wanted and dared anyone to stop them. "New transmission coming in," the communications officer reported. "It's from the Etherians." "War Leader Thax," came the musical voice of Archkeeper Valdris. "This world falls under cultural protection statutes. Your claim has no legal basis." "Legal basis?" The Kralians' laughter sounded like rocks grinding together. "Our legal basis is 30 ships armed with plasma cannons. Withdraw now, or provide target practice for my gunners." Sarah realized that her little act of rebellion had just triggered a confrontation between 2 of the most powerful species in the galaxy. Above her head, 60 warships were preparing for battle over a hole in the ground that contained something neither side fully understood. She picked up the communication device and opened a channel to both fleets. "This is Captain Sarah Chen. I think we need to talk." 3 months had passed since the standoff over Mining World 7 Alpha 432. Captain Sarah Chen now sat in a very different chair, in a very different room, facing a very different problem. The chair was leather, imported from Earth. The room was her new office aboard the UES Liberty, humanity's first deep space diplomatic vessel. The problem was still the same thing it had always been: aliens who thought rules were more important than common sense. "Captain Chen," said Ambassador Williams, a thin man with tired eyes who had spent the last year trying to make humanity look respectable to the galaxy, "we have a situation." Sarah looked up from the reports she had been reading. For 3 months, those reports had been getting more interesting and more troubling. Human colonies were doing things that made the Hegemony Council very nervous. Human traders were ignoring established shipping routes and creating new ones that cut travel time by weeks. Human scientists were sharing research data freely instead of selling it through the Guild of Knowledge. Human diplomats were making deals directly with planetary governments instead of going through official hegemony channels. "What kind of situation?" Sarah asked. Ambassador Williams placed a datapad on her desk. "The Kralian Empire has issued a formal demand for tribute from all human colonies. They want 10% of our annual production plus military service from our young people." Sarah picked up the datapad and read the official document. The language was formal and flowery, but the meaning was clear. "Pay us or face the consequences." The Kralians claimed it was an ancient tradition, a way for newer species to show respect to their elders and betters. "How much would this cost?" "Us?" Sarah asked. "Everything," Williams replied. 10% of our production would cripple our colonies, and the military service requirement would basically turn our young people into Kralian soldiers. Sarah set down the datapad and looked out the window of her office. The Liberty was currently docked at Nexus Station, one of the largest trading posts in the galaxy. Through the window she could see dozens of alien ships coming and going. Traders, diplomats, tourists, all following the same rules that had governed galactic civilization for thousands of years. "What does Earth want us to do?" Sarah asked. Williams looked uncomfortable. "Earth wants us to negotiate, find a compromise, maybe pay a smaller tribute or provide some other form of service. And what do you think?" "I think," Williams said slowly, "that if we start paying tribute to one elder species, they'll all want a piece of us. The Vorthak will want trade concessions. The Etherians will want access to our archaeological sites. The Zephirites will want exclusive shipping contracts." Sarah nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. 3 months ago, she had refused to hand over an artifact to the Etherians. Word of that refusal had spread throughout the galaxy. Some species saw it as refreshing. Others saw it as dangerous. All of them were watching to see what humanity would do next. "Where's Admiral Rodriguez?" Sarah asked. "Marcus is currently in the Kralian home system with the 3rd Fleet. He's supposed to be conducting friendly naval exercises with Kralian forces." Sarah smiled. Admiral Marcus Rodriguez had been Lieutenant Rodriguez 3 months ago, back when they were digging holes on Mining World 7 Alpha 432. His promotion had been one of many rapid changes in Earth's military structure. "When you started, ignoring galactic rules, you needed people who understood how to think outside the box. Get me a secure channel to Admiral Rodriguez," Sarah said. 20 minutes later, Admiral Rodriguez's face appeared on Sarah's communication screen. He looked older than his 28 years, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Behind him, Sarah could see the bridge of the UES Defiant, the flagship of humanity's small but growing space fleet. "Sarah," Rodriguez said, "please tell me you're calling with good news." "Afraid not, Marcus. The Kralians want tribute. Traditional, elder species privilege. 10% of everything we produce plus military service from our people." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Sarah could see him thinking, calculating options. It was a habit he had developed since taking command of the fleet. Unlike the elder species, humans had learned to make quick decisions and live with the consequences. "What's Earth's position?" Rodriguez asked. "Earth wants to negotiate, Find a compromise. And what's your position? Sarah looked at the datapad again. The tribute demand was written in formal Kralian script, with translations in 12 different languages. It was the kind of document that had been used for centuries to formalize the submission of weaker species to stronger ones. My position is that we don't pay tribute to anyone. We earn respect through our actions, not through our ability to hand over our resources. Rodriguez smiled. I was hoping you'd say that, because I've been thinking about something. What if, instead of conducting friendly exercises with the Kralians, we conducted unfriendly parking? Unfriendly parking? I've got 12 ships here, Sarah. Not big ones, not powerful ones, but they're ours. What if we took them into Kralian space and just stayed there? Not threatening anyone, not shooting at anyone, just making it clear that human ships go where human captains decide to go. Sarah felt a familiar excitement building in her chest. It was the same feeling she had gotten 3 months ago when she decided to keep digging instead of filing forms. Marcus, that could be seen as an act of war. Could be, or it could be seen as an act of independence, depends on how we present it. Sarah thought about the conversation she had had with Admiral Harrison 6 months ago. Back then, he had warned her that Earth could not afford to make enemies. But things had changed since then. Human colonies were thriving, human traders were making profits, and human scientists were making discoveries. Maybe it was time to stop worrying about making enemies and start worrying about making a point. Do it, Sarah said. But Marcus, be smart about it. No weapons charged, no aggressive maneuvers. Just park your ship somewhere visible and wait to see what happens. Understood. Rodriguez out. The next few days were tense. Reports came in from across the galaxy as news of humanity's latest suggestion spread through diplomatic channels. The Kralian Empire was furious. The Hegemony Council was confused. The Vorthak were calculating probability matrices to determine the optimal response. Sarah spent most of her time in meetings with alien diplomats who wanted to understand what humanity was trying to accomplish. The questions were always the same. Why wouldn't humans follow established procedures? Why did they insist on doing things differently? Why couldn't they just accept their place in the galactic order? Sarah's answers were always simple. Because the established procedures didn't work for humanity. Because doing things differently often produced better results. Because accepting your place in someone else's order meant giving up the right to improve your situation. On the 4th day, everything changed again. Sarah was in her quarters, reading reports from human colonies, when the ship's alarm system activated. This time the alarm was different. This was not a drill or a minor emergency. This was the sound that meant something very bad was happening somewhere in the galaxy. Sarah ran to the bridge, where she found the crew staring at the main communication screen in shock. The face on the screen belonged to Admiral Harrison, but he looked like he had aged 10 years in the past week. All human vessels, Harrison was saying. This is a priority alpha alert. Unknown hostile forces have attacked the Outer Rim colonies. Multiple worlds have gone silent. All military units are to return to their assigned sectors immediately. Sarah felt her blood turn cold. Get me more details, she ordered. The communications officer worked frantically at his console. Within minutes, reports were coming in from across the galaxy. The attacks had started at the edge of known space in regions that were barely explored. Entire colonies had simply disappeared, leaving behind only debris and strange energy signatures. Ma'am, the sensor officer called out, we're getting a priority transmission from the Hegemony Council. They're calling an emergency session. The emergency session was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Representatives from hundreds of species filled the great chamber on Centralis Prime. The usual formal procedures were abandoned as reports flooded in from the Outer Rim. The attackers were not pirates or rebels. They were something far worse. The Vorthak called them Probability Zero, threats that their calculations had determined could not exist. The Etherians called them the Hungry Dark, ancient enemies from their oldest legends. The Kralians simply called them worthy opponents and began preparing for glorious battle. The humans called them what they were, very big trouble. The creatures were unlike anything in the galactic databases. They traveled in ships that seemed To be grown rather than built. They did not communicate, did not negotiate, and did not take prisoners. They simply consumed everything in their path, breaking down matter at the molecular level and using it to build more ships. "The Devourers have returned," announced Elder Zethus of the Etherian High Council. The ancient being's voice carried centuries of fear. "We had hoped they were gone forever, lost in the dark between galaxies. We were wrong." Sarah sat with the other human representatives in a section of the chamber that had been hastily added when humanity joined the galaxy. Around them, the eldest and most powerful species in the galaxy were discussing the greatest threat they had ever faced. "Protocol Omega is now in effect," announced High Counselor Vektar of the Vorthak. "All member species will contribute ships and resources according to the defense allocation matrix. Mathematical optimization will ensure the most efficient use of available assets." Sarah listened as the defense allocation matrix was explained. It was a formula that had been created centuries ago, designed to fairly distribute the burden of galactic defense based on each species' population, resources, and military strength. According to the matrix, humanity would contribute 12 frigates to the defense fleet, 12 ships, against an enemy that had already consumed a dozen worlds. Sarah stood up, ignoring the formal protocols that required her to wait for permission to speak. "High Counselor," she said, "with respect, 12 ships won't make any difference against what we're facing." The great chamber fell silent. Hundreds of alien eyes turned to look at the human who had dared to interrupt the formal proceedings. "Captain Chen," High Counselor Vektar replied, "the defense allocation matrix has been proven effective for over 800 years. It ensures optimal resource distribution based on mathematical analysis. It ensures that humanity sits on the sidelines while other species do the fighting." Sarah replied, "We didn't ask to be part of this galaxy just so we could contribute a token force to someone else's war." Elder Zethus raised one of his forearms. "What do you propose, young human?" Sarah looked around the chamber at the representatives of species that had ruled the galaxy for millennia. They were older, wiser, and more powerful than humanity, but they were also afraid. She could see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices. They were facing something that their rules and procedures could not handle. "I propose we stop arguing about who contributes what and start figuring out how to win. The Devourers don't care about your defense allocation matrix. They don't care about your protocols or your procedures. They care about eating everything in their path. So maybe, just maybe, we should stop worrying about following the rules and start worrying about staying alive." The chamber erupted in discussion. Some species supported Sarah's position. Others were scandalized by her disregard for established procedures. The Kralians seemed pleased that someone was finally talking about fighting instead of filing forms. High Counselor Vektar called for order. "Captain Chen, do you have specific recommendations?" Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment that would define humanity's role in the galaxy. "Yes. I recommend we give every ship captain the authority to make tactical decisions without waiting for orders from committees. I recommend we share all intelligence data in real time instead of filtering it through bureaucratic channels. And I recommend we stop treating this like a formal military exercise and start treating it like a fight for survival." The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Then war leader Thax of the Kralian Empire began to laugh. It was a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the crystal walls. "The human speaks wisdom," Thax said. "Rules are for peacetime. War requires adaptability." One by one, other species began to voice their agreement. Not all of them, but enough. Within hours, the Hegemony Council had authorized the most radical military doctrine in galactic history. Ship captains would have unprecedented independence. Intelligence would be shared freely. Traditional command structures would be simplified. Sarah left the chamber feeling both excited and terrified. Humanity had just convinced the galaxy to abandon 3,000 years of military tradition. Now they had to prove that their way would work better. 2 days later, the first reports came in from the front lines. The new doctrine was working, but not in the way anyone had expected. Human captains were indeed making quick, tactical decisions, But they were also doing things that no military manual had ever contemplated. Commander Lisa Park of the UES Indomitable had saved a Vorthak dreadnought by ramming her frigate into a Devourer bioship's neural cluster. The collision had destroyed her ship, but the crew had escaped in pods while the Devourer ship died from system failure. Captain Torres of the UES Relentless had convinced a Zephyrite merchant captain to use his cargo ship as a decoy, leading a swarm of Devourer scouts into an asteroid field, where human and Kralian ships were waiting in ambush. Most shocking of all, Lieutenant Commander Kim of the UES Steadfast had actually surrendered to a Devourer ship, allowing it to absorb his vessel and crew. 20 minutes later, the Devourer ship exploded from the inside as the human crew detonated their fusion reactor. The reports kept coming in, each one more impossible than the last. Human captains were ignoring chain of command, improvising tactics that had never been tested, and somehow achieving results that formal military doctrine said were impossible. But the most disturbing report came from Admiral Rodriguez himself. His fleet had been fighting alongside Kralian forces for 3 days, and he had noticed something troubling. The Kralians were starting to act like humans. "Sarah," Rodriguez said during their daily communication, "they're not following their own battle protocols anymore. Yesterday, a Kralian captain retreated from a fight that their honor code said they had to finish. When I asked him why, he said it was tactically advantageous." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Marcus, are you telling me that we're teaching other species to break their own rules?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And Sarah, I think they like it." The war had been going on for 2 months, and the galaxy was learning something it had never expected. 3,000 years of military tradition could be completely wrong. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty, watching the tactical display that showed the current battle for the Kepler Industrial Complex. 3 weeks ago, this had been one of the most important manufacturing centers in the galaxy. Now it was a battleground where the old ways of war were dying alongside the soldiers who still believed in them. "Admiral," called Lieutenant Morrison, from the communications station, "we're getting reports from the Vorthak Third Fleet. They've lost another dreadnought." Sarah nodded grimly. The Vorthak had lost 7 major warships in the past month, and every loss followed the same pattern. The mathematical minds that made them excellent administrators made them terrible combat commanders. They calculated optimal firing solutions while Devourer bioships adapted to their targeting patterns. They planned strategic withdrawals while Devourer swarms changed their attack vectors. By the time the Vorthak had calculated the perfect response, the battle was over and they were dead. "What about the Etherians?" Sarah asked. "Their temple ships are holding position at the outer system. They're trying to commune with the cosmic balance to find a mystical solution to the Devourer threat." Sarah resisted the urge to curse. The Etherians were even worse than the Vorthak. At least the Vorthak tried to fight before they died. The Etherians spent so much time looking for spiritual meaning in the war that they rarely participated in actual battles. They claimed they were seeking a peaceful solution to the conflict, as if the Devourers would suddenly stop consuming planets if they found the right meditation technique. "And the Kralians?" Morrison's expression brightened slightly. "The Kralians are adapting. War leader Thakex is requesting permission to coordinate directly with human units." That was something, at least. The Kralians had been the first alien species to embrace what the humans called adaptive tactics. Instead of following ancient battle codes that required them to charge directly at the enemy, Kralian captains were learning to retreat, regroup, and attack from unexpected angles. Their honor-obsessed culture was slowly accepting that winning was more honorable than dying gloriously. "Put me through to Admiral Rodriguez," Sarah said. Rodriguez's face appeared on the main screen, but Sarah barely recognized him. He had lost weight, his uniform was stained with grease and sweat, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who had seen too much death in too short a time. "Sarah," Rodriguez said, "please tell me you're calling with good news." "I wish I was. Marcus, how bad is it out there?" Rodriguez ran a hand through his hair. "We're losing, Sarah, not just battles, we're losing the war. The Devourers adapt to everything we throw at them. Every tactic we use, they counter within hours. Every weapon we deploy, they learn to resist. Sarah had been reading the same reports that Rodriguez was living through. The Devourers were unlike any enemy the galaxy had ever faced. They were not just individually intelligent, they were collectively intelligent. Every ship in their fleets shared information instantly. When one Devourer learned how to counter a human tactic, they all learned it. What about the new coordination protocols? Sarah asked. Are the other species adapting? Some of them. The Kralians are getting better at thinking on their feet. A few Vorthak captains have started ignoring their calculation computers and making gut decisions. But Sarah, it's not enough. We need something completely different. Sarah looked at the tactical display again. The battle for Kepler was going badly. The combined fleet had twice as many ships as the Devourers, but they were still losing. The problem was not firepower or numbers. The problem was that 5 different species were trying to fight 5 different wars at the same time. Marcus, what if we stopped trying to coordinate different tactics and started creating one tactic that none of them could predict? What do you mean? Sarah walked closer to the screen, her mind racing through possibilities. The Devourers adapt to patterns. They learn from our tactics and counter them. But what if we did something so chaotic, so completely random, that there was no pattern to learn from? Rodriguez frowned. Sarah, random tactics usually mean random results, and random results usually mean losing. Not random tactics, Marcus. Random coordination. What if, instead of trying to get everyone to fight the same way, we encouraged everyone to fight their own way at the same time? Before Rodriguez could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the Liberty. Sarah turned to see Morrison frantically working at his station. Admiral? Morrison called out. We're getting emergency signals from the Nexus defense fleet. The Devourers are attacking Nexus Station. Sarah felt her heart sink. Nexus Station was not just a military target. It was the commercial heart of the galaxy. Millions of civilians lived and worked there. If it fell, the economic impact would cripple dozens of worlds. How long until the Devourers reach the station? Sarah asked. At current speed, 18 hours, Morrison replied. How long until the nearest military fleet can respond? Morrison checked his displays. The Kralian Second Fleet could be there in 22 hours. The Vorthak Industrial Defense Force could arrive in 36 hours. Sarah stared at the numbers. Nexus Station would fall 4 hours before the first relief force arrived, unless someone did something completely insane. Morrison, get me a secure channel to every human ship in the sector, and I mean every ship. Military, civilian, cargo haulers, passenger liners, everything. Ma'am, you heard me. Every human ship. 20 minutes later, Sarah was looking at a communication screen filled with dozens of faces. Ship captains, cargo haulers, passenger liner commanders, even the captain of a small research vessel that had been studying asteroid composition in a nearby system. They all had one thing in common. They were human, and they were about to be asked to do something that military protocol said was impossible. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah began, Nexus Station is under attack. The Devourers will reach it in 18 hours. The nearest military fleet won't arrive for 22 hours. That means we're the only help those people are going to get. Captain Williams of the cargo hauler Prosperity raised his hand. Admiral, with respect, I'm flying a converted freighter with minimal weapons. I couldn't fight a Devourer scout ship, much less a fleet. You're right, Sarah replied. In a normal fight, you wouldn't stand a chance. But this isn't going to be a normal fight. This is going to be the most abnormal fight in galactic history. Sarah activated the tactical display that showed the route to Nexus Station. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take every ship we have, no matter how small or poorly armed, and we're going to attack the Devourer fleet using the most chaotic, unpredictable tactics we can imagine. Commander Torres of the UES steadfast frowned. Admiral, that sounds like suicide. Maybe. Or maybe it's the first tactic the Devourers won't be able to adapt to. They learn from patterns, right? Well, what if there is no pattern? What if every ship attacks differently, retreats differently, and fights differently? The screen fell silent as the assembled captains considered what Sarah was proposing. She was asking civilian cargo haulers to fight alongside military vessels. She was asking passenger liner captains to risk their ships and their passengers. She was asking everyone to abandon every rule of military engagement that had ever been written. "Admiral," said Captain Kim of the passenger liner New Horizons, "I've got 3,000 civilians aboard my ship. How do I explain to them that we're going into battle against the most dangerous enemy in the galaxy?" Sarah looked at Kim's worried face. "You tell them the truth. You tell them that sometimes civilians have to become heroes because there's no one else available. You tell them that humanity doesn't follow rules when those rules mean letting innocent people die." One by one, the captains began to volunteer. The cargo haulers would carry improvised weapons and ram Devourer ships. The passenger liners would evacuate civilians from Nexus Station, while the military vessels provided cover. The research ship would use its advanced sensors to identify Devourer weak points. But Sarah had one more surprise in mind. "Morrison," she said after ending the communication, "get me a channel to the Etherean temple ship Harmony of Spheres. I want to talk to Archkeeper Valdris." Morrison looked confused. "Ma'am, the Etherians aren't participating in military actions. They're still looking for a peaceful solution." "I know, but I think I might have found one." An hour later, Sarah was speaking with the same Etherian who had demanded surrender of the artifact 6 months ago. Archkeeper Valdris looked exactly the same as he had then. Ancient, wise, and completely convinced that violence was never the answer to anything. "Captain Chen," Valdris said in his musical voice, "I am pleased that you seek alternatives to warfare. The Etherian Council has been meditating on solutions that do not require the destruction of life." "Archkeeper," Sarah replied, "what if I told you there was a way to save millions of lives at Nexus Station without actually destroying the Devourers?" Valdris tilted his head. A gesture that Sarah had learned indicated interest. "Explain." Sarah activated a display showing the Devourer fleet's approach to Nexus Station. The Devourers consume matter to build more ships. But what if, instead of feeding them metal and organic compounds, we fed them something they couldn't digest? Continue. "Your temple ships are made of crystallized harmony fields, right? Matter that exists in a state of perfect balance between energy and substance. What if a Devourer tried to consume that?" Valdris was quiet for a long moment. Sarah could see him thinking, calculating the implications of what she was suggesting. The Etherians had spent centuries perfecting their harmony field technology. Their ships were not just vessels. They were works of art that embodied their spiritual beliefs about the balance of the universe. "You are asking us to sacrifice our temple ships," Valdris finally said. "I'm asking you to use them as weapons in a way that doesn't require violence. The Devourers won't be destroyed, they'll be confused. Their digestive systems won't be able to process harmony field matter. They'll be forced to stop and figure out what went wrong. And while they are confused, your ships will attack them." Sarah nodded. "While they're confused, we'll evacuate the civilians from Nexus Station. No unnecessary destruction, no loss of life on either side. Just enough chaos to buy time for people to escape." Valdris considered the proposal for several minutes. Sarah could see the internal struggle on his face. The Etherians had never used their ships as weapons, even passive weapons. But they had also never faced an enemy that threatened the spiritual balance of the entire galaxy. "Very well, Captain Chen. The Harmony of Spheres will assist in your chaotic solution." The Battle of Nexus Station began 16 hours later and lasted exactly 43 minutes. It was the shortest major engagement of the war, and also the most effective. The human fleet arrived first, spreading out in a formation that made no tactical sense. Cargo haulers flew alongside military cruisers. Passenger liners positioned themselves between research vessels and converted mining ships. To any observer using traditional military analysis, it looked like complete chaos. To the Devourers, it was completely chaos. The bioships that had adapted to Vorthak mathematical precision and Kralian honor charges suddenly found themselves facing opponents that had no pattern at all. A cargo hauler would ram a scout ship, then retreat in a random direction. A passenger liner would fire a single torpedo at a cruiser, then start broadcasting civilian distress calls. A research vessel would scan a dreadnought for 30 seconds, then suddenly accelerate toward a completely different target. The Devourers tried to adapt, but there was nothing to adapt to. Every time they began to recognize a pattern, the humans would do something completely different. When the bioships began targeting the largest human vessels, the humans scattered into groups of 3 or 4 ships. When the Devourers tried to predict the humans' next move, the humans stopped following any tactical doctrine and started improvising based on whatever random idea occurred to their captains. The chaos reached its peak when the Etherean temple ship Harmony of Spheres flew directly into the center of the Devourer fleet and allowed itself to be consumed by the largest bioship. The results were immediate and spectacular. The Devourer, dreadnought that had absorbed the temple ship, suddenly stopped moving. Its bioluminescent hull began flickering between different colors as its digestive systems tried to process matter that existed in 17 different dimensions simultaneously. The confusion spread to other Devourer ships through their collective intelligence network. Within minutes, the entire Devourer fleet was paralyzed, trying to understand what they had just eaten. The humans used those minutes to evacuate 3 million civilians from Nexus Station. By the time the Devourers recovered from their confusion, the station was empty and the human fleet was gone. The bioships found themselves in possession of a prize that was no longer worth having. The victory at Nexus Station changed everything. News of the battle spread throughout the galaxy within hours, carried by the same trade networks that the humans had been improperly using for months. The story grew with each telling, but the core message remained the same. Humanity had saved millions of lives using tactics that no military academy had ever taught. More importantly, other species began to copy human methods. Admiral Sarah Chen received the first report 3 days later. A Vorthak captain named Kethvar had been facing a Devourer attack on a mining colony. Instead of calculating optimal, defensive positions, he had ordered his ships to randomly change their formations every 30 seconds. The Devourers, unable to predict their target's movements, had eventually given up and moved on to easier prey. The second report came from a Kralian war leader who had convinced a group of Zephyrite merchant ships to help him in battle. Instead of charging honorably at the enemy, the Kralians had used the merchants as decoys while launching surprise attacks from unexpected angles. Even the Ethereans began to change. Instead of seeking mystical balance, some temple ships started using their harmony fields as offensive weapons, creating zones of dimensional instability that the Devourers could not navigate. The most significant change, however, came from the Hegemony Council itself. For the first time in 3,000 years, they issued a directive that violated their own procedures. All fleet commanders were authorized to ignore military protocol, if doing so would save lives or achieve victory. Sarah was reading this directive when Admiral Rodriguez contacted her from the front lines. "Sarah," Rodriguez said, his face appearing on her communication screen, "I think we might have a problem." "What kind of problem, Marcus?" "The kind where our success is creating bigger problems. The other species are learning to fight like humans, but they're also learning to think like humans, and some of them are starting to question other things. Besides military doctrine." Sarah felt a familiar chill. "What do you mean?" "I mean that a Vorthak colony just declared independence from the Hegemony Council. They said that if ship captains can ignore military protocol, planetary governors can ignore administrative protocol. The Kralians are backing them up, saying that independence is an honorable choice." Sarah stared at the screen as the implications sank in. Humanity had not just taught the galaxy how to fight differently, they had taught the galaxy how to think differently. And once you started thinking differently about one thing, it was hard to stop thinking differently about everything else. "Marcus," Sarah said slowly, "I think we may have accidentally started a revolution." 6 months after the Battle of Nexus Station, Admiral Sarah Chen stood before the Hegemony Council once again. But this time, the Great Chamber looked very different. Half the seats were empty, the other half were filled with representatives, who looked like they had not slept in weeks. The galaxy was falling apart and everyone was blaming humanity. "Admiral Chen," said High Counselor Vector of the Vorthak, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent months trying to maintain order in an increasingly chaotic universe. "Your species has created a crisis that threatens the very foundation of galactic civilization." Sarah looked around the chamber at the faces of aliens who had once seemed so powerful and wise. Now they just looked tired and confused. 3,000 years of tradition had been shattered in 6 months, and nobody knew how to put it back together. "High Counselor," Sarah replied, "we didn't create this crisis. We just revealed that your foundation had some serious cracks in it." Elder Zethus of the Etherian High Council raised one of his 4 arms. 17 worlds have declared independence from hegemony authority. Trade routes established over millennia have been abandoned for more efficient alternatives. Colonial governors are ignoring administrative directives. The very concept of galactic order is dissolving. Sarah nodded. She had been reading the reports for months. The war against the Devourers was going better than anyone had expected, but the cost was higher than anyone had calculated. By teaching the galaxy to ignore military rules, humanity had accidentally taught them to ignore all rules. The Zephyrite Merchant Guild has filed over 3,000 complaints about unfair trade practices, continued Elder Zethus. Apparently, some species have decided that established shipping contracts are merely suggestions. The Guild had a monopoly on interstellar commerce for 800 years, Sarah replied. Maybe a little competition is good for everyone. War leader Thakix of the Kralian Empire stood up from his massive chair. Unlike the other council members, he did not look tired. He looked excited. "The human speaks truth. For too long we have followed ancient laws that served ancient purposes. The galaxy has changed. The laws should change with it." High Counselor Vektar's skin shifted to a deeper shade of gray, which Sarah had learned was a sign of stress among the Vorthak. "War leader Thax, you cannot seriously support the abandonment of all legal framework. Without the Codex Universalis, we would have chaos." "We already have chaos," Thax replied. "The difference is that now it is useful chaos." Sarah watched the exchange with interest. The Kralians had been the first species to fully embrace human, tactical thinking, and now they were applying the same principles to politics. Instead of following ancient honor codes, they were making decisions based on what worked in the present situation. "If I may," Sarah said, standing up from her chair, "I think we're missing the point here. The Codex Universalis wasn't handed down by gods. It was written by people, by beings, who were trying to solve the problems of their time. Now we have different problems. The Codex has maintained peace for 3 millennia, Elder Zethus protested. "The Codex maintains stability," Sarah corrected. "But stability isn't the same thing as peace. How many species were kept in inferior positions because changing the system was against the rules? How many innovations were suppressed because they didn't fit established procedures? How many problems went unsolved because solving them would have required breaking tradition?" The chamber fell silent. Sarah could see that her words were having an effect, but she could not tell if it was a good effect or a bad one. "What do you propose, Admiral Chen?" asked High Counselor Vektar. Sarah had been thinking about this question for months, ever since the reports started coming in about colonies declaring independence and trade guilds losing their monopolies. She had been trying to figure out what humanity had really unleashed on the galaxy. "I propose that we stop trying to put things back the way they were and start figuring out how to make them work the way they are. The old system is broken. We can either fight a losing battle to restore it, or we can build something better." "And what would this something better look like?" asked Elder Zethus. Before Sarah could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the chamber. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately. Incoming emergency transmission. The main display screen activated, showing the face of Admiral Rodriguez. But he was not calling from his flagship. He was calling from the bridge of what appeared to be a Devourer bioship. "Sarah," Rodriguez said, his voice filled with excitement and exhaustion. "You need to see this. We just did something that should have been impossible." "Marcus, are you on a Devourer ship?" "I'm on the former Devourer ship Consumption of Worlds. Emphasis on former. We captured it." The chamber erupted in discussion. Capturing a Devourer ship was not just difficult, it was theoretically impossible. The bioships were designed to self-destruct, rather than allow themselves to be taken by enemy forces. "How?" Sarah asked. Rodriguez grinned. "By using the most insane battle plan in galactic history. We convinced the Devourers to surrender. You convinced them to surrender? Well, technically, we convinced them that surrendering was more interesting than fighting. It turns out that the Devourers aren't just consumers. They're also curious. When we offered to teach them about human military doctrine, they decided that learning something new was worth more than eating a few planets. Sarah stared at the screen in disbelief. Marcus, are you telling me that you ended a major battle by offering to give the enemy a tactical seminar? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And Sarah, it worked. Not just for us, the word is spreading through the Devourer fleet. They're starting to see the war as a learning experience instead of a feeding opportunity. High Counselor Vector leaned forward in his chair. Admiral Rodriguez, what is the current status of the Devourer threat? Greatly reduced, High Counselor. About half their fleet has agreed to ceasefire terms in exchange for access to our tactical databases. The other half is still fighting, but they're using human tactics now. Turns out when Devourers start thinking like humans, they're a lot less interested in consuming everything, and a lot more interested in seeing what happens next. Elder Zythus spoke up. This is unprecedented. In 3,000 years of galactic history, no one has ever convinced an enemy force to change their fundamental nature. That's because, Sarah said, no one ever tried. Everyone assumed that the Devourers were just mindless consumers because that's what they had always been. But humans have a saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Maybe the Devourers were consuming planets because consumption was the only tool they knew how to use. War Leader Thax began laughing again, the harsh barking sound that had become familiar to Sarah over the past months. The humans have done it again. They have turned our greatest enemy into our most interesting student. Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the feeling that she was about to do something that would change everything. High Counselor Vector, I formally request permission to address the full Hegemony Council with a proposal for post-war galactic governance. Granted, Vector replied, though he looked like he was already regretting the decision. Sarah activated the chamber's main display system and began presenting what would later be known as the Human Doctrine. For 3,000 years, she began, galactic civilization has been based on the principle that stability requires unchanging rules. The Codex Universalis was designed to prevent conflict by making sure everyone knew their place and stayed in it. The display showed a map of the galaxy, with different colors representing different species' territories and spheres of influence. This system worked as long as the galaxy remained static. But the galaxy isn't static anymore. We have new technologies, new threats, and new opportunities. The old rules don't just fail to address these changes, they actively prevent us from adapting to them. Sarah changed the display to show the current state of the galaxy. Instead of neat, stable boundaries, there were overlapping zones of influence, mixed settlements, and complex trade relationships that violated dozens of traditional territorial agreements. The Human Doctrine is based on a simple principle. Rules exist to serve life, not the other way around. When a rule stops serving its purpose, you change the rule. When a system stops working, you build a better system. And how, asked Elder Zythus, do you prevent this from leading to complete chaos? Sarah smiled. You don't prevent chaos. You use it. Chaos isn't the opposite of order, it's the raw material that order is made from. The trick is learning to shape chaos instead of trying to suppress it. She changed the display again, showing battle reports from the war against the Devourers. Human tactical doctrine works because it embraces uncertainty. We plan for multiple possibilities, adapt to changing conditions, and treat every problem as an opportunity to learn something new. But how do you apply this to governance? Asked High Counselor Vector. The same way we applied it to warfare. Instead of rigid laws that cover every possible situation, you create flexible principles that can be adapted to any situation. Instead of centralized control that requires every decision to go through committees, you give local authorities the power to solve local problems. Sarah activated a new display showing her proposed governmental structure. The new Galactic Compact would be based on 3 core principles: adaptability, transparency, and accountability. Any species, any world, any organization would have the right to propose changes to existing agreements. But they would also have the responsibility to prove that their changes would benefit everyone involved. War leader Thax stood up. This is acceptable to the Kralian Empire. We have seen the benefits of human thinking in warfare. We would see the benefits in governance as well. One by one, other species began to voice their support. Not all of them, but enough. The Vorthak agreed to try the new system on a trial basis, as long as they could calculate probability matrices for different outcomes. The Zephyrite supported anything that would allow for more flexible trade agreements. Even some Etherian representatives acknowledged that their spiritual beliefs were compatible with a system based on growth and change. But the real test came 3 days later, when the first crisis under the new system occurred. A Devourer fleet had approached the industrial world of Kepler Prime, but instead of attacking, they had requested permission to establish a research colony on one of the planet's moons. They wanted to study human tactical innovations in exchange for sharing their biotechnology with local manufacturers. Under the old system, such a request would have taken months to process through various committees and councils. The Devourers would have either left or reverted to their old consuming behavior long before any decision was reached. Under the new system, the local planetary governor had the authority to make the decision immediately. Within 6 hours, Kepler Prime had become the first world in galactic history to host a peaceful Devourer colony. The arrangement worked so well that within a month, 17 other worlds had requested similar agreements. The Devourers, it turned out, were excellent at solving problems that required thinking outside conventional parameters. Their biotechnology, when directed toward construction instead of consumption, could build cities in days instead of years. Sarah was reviewing reports about these developments when Admiral Rodriguez contacted her with the most surprising news yet. "Sarah," Rodriguez said, "I just received a formal request from the Devourer High Collective. They want to join the Galactic Compact as a full member species." Sarah stared at the screen. "They want to join? 6 months ago they were trying to eat us. Apparently they've decided that cooperation is more efficient than consumption. They've calculated that they can acquire more resources through trade and collaboration than they ever could through conquest." "Who taught them to calculate things like that?" Rodriguez grinned. "We did. Turns out when you teach someone to think like a human, they start reaching human conclusions." Sarah leaned back in her chair and considered the implications. The galaxy's greatest enemy had just asked to become its newest ally. The species that had threatened to consume civilization was now requesting permission to help build it. "Marcus," she said, "I think we may have accidentally solved the entire war." "It gets better, Sarah. The Devourer representative wants to meet with you personally to discuss the terms of their membership. They specifically requested you because, and I quote, "the human Chen demonstrates optimal adaptive thinking patterns." Sarah laughed. 6 months ago, she had been a mining ship captain who refused to follow alien bureaucracy. Now she was apparently the galaxy's leading expert on adaptive thinking patterns. "Set up the meeting," she said. "But Marcus, make sure we have plenty of backup plans. I have a feeling that negotiating with former galactic destroyers is going to require some very creative thinking." "Already on it." "And Sarah? The Devourers have requested that the negotiations be conducted using human diplomatic protocols instead of traditional hegemony procedures." "We don't have diplomatic protocols. Marcus, we make them up as we go along." "Exactly, that's what they're counting on." 1 year after the Battle of Nexus Station, Admiral Sarah Chen stood in a place she had never expected to see. The bridge of a Devourer bioship that had been converted into a diplomatic vessel. The ship's living walls pulsed with soft bioluminescent patterns that, according to her translator, meant peaceful intentions and mutual curiosity. Sarah was here for the most important negotiation in galactic history, the formal integration of the Devourer collective into what was now being called the Adaptive Galactic Compact. It was a name that made the old Hegemony Council members wince, but it accurately described what the galaxy had become. "Admiral Chen," said Hivemind Designation Prime, the Devourer representative, "we have completed our analysis of human diplomatic methodologies. We find them chaotic yet effective." Sarah smiled. The Devourers had been studying human behavior for months, trying to understand how a species that seemed to make up rules as they went along could be so successful at solving problems that had stumped the galaxy for millennia. "We prefer to call it adaptive," Sarah replied. "But chaotic works too." Prime's bioluminescent patterns shifted to what the translator called amused agreement. The Devourers had developed their own sense of humor, apparently by observing human behavior and concluding that laughter was a useful tool for reducing stress during complex negotiations. "Admiral," Prime continued, "we must address a concern that has emerged during our integration process. Several elder species have expressed resistance to our membership in the compact." Sarah had been expecting this. The Vorthak, in particular, were having trouble accepting that their former enemies were now their partners in building a new galactic civilization. They had calculated the probability of successful Devourer integration at 23.7%, which they considered unacceptably low. "What kind of resistance?" Sarah asked. "The Vorthak have submitted 847 formal objections to our membership application. The Etherians have requested that we undergo spiritual purification rituals before being granted full diplomatic status. The Zephyrites want us to sign trade agreements that would essentially make us their vassals." Sarah sighed. Even after a year of dramatic changes, some species were still trying to solve new problems with old thinking. They could not understand that the Devourers were no longer the enemy because they could not understand that anyone could change their fundamental nature. "What do the Kralians think?" Sarah asked. Prime's pattern shifted to what looked like approval. "War Leader Thax has declared that our transformation from consumers to creators is the most honorable victory in galactic history. The Kralians support full membership with no conditions." That was encouraging. The Kralians had been humanity's strongest allies in reforming galactic governance. Their culture's emphasis on honor and strength had translated well to the new system's emphasis on adaptability and results. "Prime," Sarah said, "what do the Devourers want from membership in the compact?" The bioluminescent patterns on Prime's form shifted through several complex configurations, before settling on something the translator called determined purpose. "We want to prove that change is possible. For millennia, we consumed because consumption was our nature. But humans taught us that nature is not destiny. We want to help build something instead of destroying it." Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the feeling that she was about to make a decision that would affect the entire galaxy. "Then let's give you that chance." The formal signing ceremony took place 3 days later on Centralis Prime, in the same chamber where Sarah had first challenged the Hegemony Council 2 years ago, but the chamber looked very different now. The rigid seating arrangements had been replaced with flexible configurations that could be adapted for different types of meetings. The ancient ceremonial protocols had been simplified to focus on practical results rather than traditional procedures. Most importantly, the council itself had changed. Instead of 5 elder species making decisions for everyone else, the new compact included representatives from 17 different civilizations, including several that had been considered junior partners under the old system. Sarah watched as Prime approached the signing platform, moving with the flowing grace that characterized all Devourer bioforms. The assembled representatives watched in fascination as the former Galaxy Destroyer prepared to become the galaxy's newest builder. "Before we proceed," said High Counselor Vectar, who had somehow managed to adapt to the new system despite his species' love of rigid procedures, "I must ask, how can we be certain that the Devourers will not revert to their previous behavior?" Prime's form shifted to display patterns that the translator called patient explanation. "High Counselor, how can you be certain that any species will not revert to previous behavior? The Kralians were once conquerors. The Zephyrites were once isolationists. The Vorthak were once religious extremists. All species change. The question is not whether change is possible, but whether it is beneficial." Elder Zethus raised one of his 4 arms. "The Etherian Council has determined that the cosmic balance requires trust in transformation. We support the Devourer application." One by one, the other representatives voiced their support. Not all of them were enthusiastic, but they all recognized that the old system of exclusion and rigid hierarchy had failed when it mattered most. The new system would either succeed through inclusion and adaptation, or it would fail for reasons that had nothing to do with who was allowed to participate. Sarah was asked to speak on behalf of humanity, since humans were considered the architects of the new system. She stood up and looked around the chamber at the faces of beings who represented dozens of different worlds, cultures, and ways of thinking. 2 years ago, she began, I stood in this chamber and was told that humans needed to follow the rules because that's how things had always been done. Today we're writing new rules because that's how things need to be done. She activated the chamber's display system, showing an image of the galaxy as it appeared now. Instead of rigid territorial boundaries, there were networks of cooperation that crossed species lines. Instead of isolated colonies, there were joint ventures that combined the strengths of multiple civilizations. The human doctrine isn't really about humans, Sarah continued. It's about the idea that intelligence means learning, and learning means changing. Every species in this chamber has changed over the past 2 years. We've all learned new ways to fight, new ways to trade, new ways to solve problems. She changed the display to show recent developments. Devourer biocities rising on formerly barren worlds. Vorthok mathematicians working with human engineers to design impossible architecture. Etherian mystics collaborating with Kralian warriors to develop new forms of peaceful conflict resolution. The Devourers want to join us because they've learned that creation is more interesting than consumption. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need more of, because the universe is big and complicated and full of problems we haven't even discovered yet. We're going to need all the creative thinking we can get. The signing ceremony proceeded without incident, though Sarah noticed that several of the traditional protocols were quietly ignored in favor of more practical approaches. Instead of ancient oaths and ceremonial procedures, Prime simply stated their commitment to the Compact's principles and signed the agreement using a biostylus that grew from their own cellular structure. The real celebration began later, at Array, a reception that mixed diplomatic traditions from dozens of different species. Sarah found herself standing with Admiral Rodriguez, watching as Devourer bioarchitects demonstrated their latest construction techniques to fascinated Vorthok engineers. You know, Rodriguez said, 2 years ago, I thought our biggest problem was going to be learning to follow alien rules. Now I'm watching our former enemies teach algebra to mathematical specialists. Sarah laughed. Marcus, I don't think our problems are getting smaller. I think we're just getting better at enjoying them. What do you mean? Sarah gestured toward the crowd of mixed species engaged in animated discussions about everything from biotechnology to mystical philosophy to military tactics. Look around. 6 months ago, most of these people had never spoken to each other. Now they're collaborating on projects that none of them could have imagined on their own. Rodriguez nodded. The Etherian Kralian peace meditation techniques are particularly interesting. Who would have thought that combining warrior discipline with mystical balance would create such effective conflict resolution methods? That's exactly my point. We're not just solving old problems anymore. We're creating new possibilities, and the more different perspectives we include, the more possibilities we can create. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young human officer who Sarah recognized as Lieutenant Kim, formerly of the passenger liner New Horizons. He had been promoted to diplomatic liaison after his work evacuating civilians during the Nexus station battle. Admiral Chen, Kim said, we're getting reports from the Outer Rim colonies. Something new is happening out there. Sarah felt a familiar combination of excitement and worry. In the past 2 years, something new usually meant either a breakthrough that would benefit everyone or a crisis that would require creative solutions. Good new or bad new? Sarah asked. Both, ma'am. We've made contact with a new species. They call themselves the Architects, and they've been watching our war with the Devourers from outside the galaxy. Rodriguez frowned. Watching from outside? The galaxy? How is that possible? Kim activated a portable display device. According to their initial communication, they exist in a parallel dimension that overlaps with our space. They've been observing galactic civilization for millennia, waiting for us to develop what they call adaptive intelligence. Sarah stared at the display, which showed an image that hurt her eyes to look at directly. The Architects appeared to exist in more than 3 dimensions, making them difficult for normal beings to perceive clearly. What do they want? Sarah asked. That's where it gets interesting, ma'am. They say they've been looking for species that can learn to think beyond their original parameters. They think humanity, and our influence on the galaxy, represents the kind of evolutionary leap they've been waiting for. Rodriguez looked skeptical. Evolutionary leap toward what? Multidimensional civilization, sir. Apparently our galaxy is just one layer of a much larger reality. The architects want to invite us to participate in something they call the Greater Compact, a network of civilizations that spans multiple universes. Sarah felt that familiar sensation again, but stronger this time. She had thought that reforming galactic civilization was a big challenge. Now it appeared that galactic civilization was just the beginning. Kim, she said, set up a meeting with these architects, but make sure we bring representatives from all member species. If we're going to start making decisions about multidimensional politics, we're going to need input from everyone. Yes, ma'am. The architects specifically requested that the negotiations be conducted using what they called human adaptive protocols. They're apparently very interested in our approach to creative problem solving. After Kim left, Sarah and Rodriguez stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the mixed species celebration continue around them. You know, Rodriguez said eventually, when I was a kid back on Earth, I used to dream about exploring the galaxy and meeting alien civilizations. I never imagined that the biggest challenge would be teaching them to think like humans. Sarah smiled. I don't think we taught them to think like humans, Marcus. I think we taught them to think like themselves, but better. The Devourers are still Devourers. They just channel their consumption drive into learning instead of destroying. The Kralians are still warriors. They just fight problems instead of each other. The Vorthak still love their calculations. They just calculate possibilities instead of limitations. And what about us? What are humans becoming in all this? Before Sarah could answer, the celebration was interrupted by an announcement that echoed throughout the chamber. Prime was speaking, their bioluminescent patterns visible to everyone present. Fellow beings of the Adaptive Compact, Prime's translated voice carried clearly over the crowd. We wish to share an observation that our collective consciousness has reached regarding human behavior. The chamber quieted as everyone turned their attention to the former galaxy destroyer, who was now their newest ally. For 1 year, we have studied human methods of problem solving. We have analyzed their tactical innovations, their diplomatic approaches, and their social structures. We have reached a conclusion that we believe is important for all species to understand. Prime's patterns shifted to what the translator called profound realization. Humans do not follow rules because they do not see rules the way other species see rules. Where we see permanent structures that define behavior, humans see temporary tools that can be modified or replaced. Where we see boundaries that cannot be crossed, humans see challenges that can be overcome. Where we see impossibilities, humans see opportunities. The chamber was completely silent now. Even the background hum of the building's systems seemed to have quieted. This is not because humans are superior to other species, Prime continued. It is because humans approach every situation with the assumption that change is possible. They do not ask, how do we follow the existing rules? They ask, what rules would work better? This perspective has transformed not only their own species, but every species they have encountered. Sarah felt a strange mixture of pride and responsibility. She had never thought of humanity as teachers or reformers. They had just been trying to survive in a galaxy that seemed determined to make survival as complicated as possible. The Devourer Collective therefore proposes, Prime said, that the first principle of the Adaptive Compact should be formally stated as follows. The purpose of intelligence is not to preserve existing patterns, but to create better ones. The proposal was approved unanimously, though Sarah noticed that some species took longer to vote than others. The Vorthak, in particular, seemed to spend several minutes calculating the implications before agreeing. As the formal reception continued, Sarah found herself approached by beings from species she had never met before. Word of the new compact was spreading beyond the original member civilizations. and representatives from distant worlds were arriving to observe the proceedings. One of these visitors was particularly interesting, a being that introduced itself as Scholar Zix from the Meridian Research Collective, a species that existed entirely in digital form and traveled between worlds as pure information. Admiral Chen, Scholar Zix said, speaking through a translation device that made their voice sound like music played through a computer. My collective has been monitoring the development of what you call the human doctrine for the past standard year. We find it unprecedented. In what way? Sarah asked. In our travels between civilizations, we have observed that most species develop technological and social capabilities in predictable patterns. They advance to a certain level, establish stable systems, and then maintain those systems for millennia. Your species has introduced something we have never seen before, the concept of deliberately destabilizing successful systems in order to create better ones. Sarah considered this. We don't really think of it as destabilizing. We think of it as improving. But improvement requires change, and change requires accepting the risk of failure. Most civilizations become risk-averse once they achieve stability. Humans appear to become more willing to take risks as they become more successful. This suggests a fundamentally different relationship with uncertainty. Before Sarah could respond, another alarm sounded throughout the chamber. But this time, it was not an emergency alert. It was the signal for a scheduled announcement from the Compact's new early warning network. High Counselor Vector activated the chamber's main display. Fellow representatives, we have received a priority communication from the Outer Rim Survey Fleet. Captain Torres, please report. Captain Torres's face appeared on the screen. She was calling from the bridge of the UES Explorer, one of humanity's newest deep space vessels. Behind her, Sarah could see crew members from at least 4 different species working together at various stations. High Counselor, Torres said, we've encountered something that requires immediate attention from the Compact leadership. We've found evidence of another galaxy-level threat, but this one is different from the Devourers. Sarah felt her heart sink. Just when things were finally stabilizing, another crisis was emerging. What kind of threat? Sarah asked. Temporal distortions, Admiral. Something is causing space-time fractures that could eventually tear apart reality itself. But here's the interesting part. The fractures appear to be artificial. Someone or something is deliberately damaging the fabric of the universe. The chamber erupted in concerned discussion. Temporal warfare was theoretical for most species, something that existed only in the realm of advanced physics and philosophical speculation. Do we have any idea who's responsible? Asked War Leader Thax. That's where it gets complicated, Torres replied. The energy signatures match technology from the Hegemony archives, ancient Etherian technology specifically, but it's been modified with techniques that none of our databases recognize. Elder Zythus stepped forward, his ancient face showing what might have been fear. Impossible. Etherian temporal research was abandoned 5,000 years ago. The knowledge was sealed in the deepest archives. Well, somebody unsealed it, Torres said, and they're using it to punch holes in reality. Admiral, we need to respond to this, but I have no idea how you fight an enemy that can attack you from different points in time. Sarah looked around, the chamber at the faces of beings who represented the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. 2 years ago, they would have spent months debating proper procedures and calculating optimal responses. Now they were all looking at her, waiting for her to suggest something that no one had ever tried before. Torres, Sarah said, how much time do we have before these fractures become a serious problem? Unknown, ma'am. The distortions are expanding, but the rate of expansion is inconsistent. Could be days, could be years. Time doesn't seem to work normally in the affected areas. Sarah felt that familiar sensation one more time, but now it was accompanied by something new. Confidence. Not in the outcome, but in the process. Whatever this new threat was, humanity and their allies would figure out how to deal with it. Because that's what they did now. They figured things out. All right, Sarah said. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to treat this like every other impossible problem we've faced. We're going to make up a solution as we go along. She activated the chamber's display system and began outlining what would later be known as the Temporal Response Protocol. First, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Scholar Zix, can your collective analyze temporal distortion patterns faster than physical beings? Affirmative, Admiral. Digital consciousness experiences time differently than biological consciousness. We should be able to process temporal data more efficiently. Good. Prime, can Devourer biotechnology adapt to environments where time doesn't work normally? Prime's patterns shifted to what the translator called interested speculation. Unknown, but we find the challenge stimulating. Our cellular structures are highly adaptive. We will attempt to develop time-resistant bioforms. Sarah turned to the other representatives. Vorthek mathematical models, Etherian mystical knowledge, Kralian tactical thinking, Zephyrate logistical coordination. We're going to need all of it, but we're going to use it in ways that none of us have ever tried before. High Counselor Vektar looked worried. Admiral Chen, you are proposing to address a threat that could destroy reality itself using methods that have never been tested. High Counselor, Sarah replied, 2 years ago you would have been right to be concerned. But 2 years ago we hadn't learned the most important lesson that humans have to teach. Which is? Sarah smiled, looking around the chamber at the assembled representatives of a galaxy that had learned to embrace change instead of fearing it. The most important lesson is this. When you don't know how to solve a problem, you figure it out, as you go along. And when you're dealing with something that's never happened before, making it up as you go along isn't just acceptable. It's the only option that makes sense. 3 weeks later, the first reports came in from the Temporal Response Fleet. The mission was proceeding exactly as Sarah had expected. Nothing was going according to plan, everything was more complicated than anticipated, and somehow they were making progress anyway. The breakthrough came when a young Devourer bioengineer named Growth Through Learning suggested that instead of trying to fight the temporal distortions, they should try to communicate with them. The idea was so bizarre that it took 6 different translation programs to explain it to the rest of the fleet. But it worked. The temporal distortions, it turned out, were not weapons at all. They were attempts at communication by a civilization that existed across multiple time periods simultaneously. They had been trying to contact the galaxy for millennia, but their messages kept tearing holes in normal space-time. Once the fleet established proper communication protocols, the situation became clear. The temporal beings were refugees from a universe that had been destroyed by something they called the Silence, a force that eliminated not just matter and energy, but the very possibility of existence. And according to the refugees, the Silence was heading toward this universe next. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty, reading the latest reports from the Temporal Response Fleet, and realized that the galaxy's problems were about to get much bigger. But for the first time since leaving Earth, she wasn't worried about humanity's ability to adapt. After all, they had spent the past 2 years teaching the galaxy that rules were just suggestions, that enemies could become allies, and that impossible problems were just opportunities to learn something new. If the Silence wanted to eliminate the possibility of existence, it was about to discover that humans, and their friends, had become very good at creating new possibilities out of nothing at all. The galaxy had learned humanity's most important lesson. When the rules don't work, you make better rules, and when better rules aren't enough, you make new realities. The universe was about to find out what that looked like in practice.